Okay. All right, well, thank you. And yes, once again, welcome to our national and international friends here. And yes, I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Esti Blanco-Elorrieta today. And I first remember meeting Dr. Blanco-Elorrieta at the then named CUNY Conference on Human Sentence Processing when we hosted it at UF back in 2015. And already at the time, Esti was quite an impressive scholar. And I actually thought that she was way further along in her graduate education at the moment than she actually was. So I've never shared that with Esti before, but anyways, that is the true impression from me. She's currently a postdoctoral scholar working under the supervision of Alfonso Caramazza in the Cognitive Neuropsychology Lab at Harvard University. And Dr. Blanco-Elorrieta has, from my view, totally established herself as a prolific and prominent scholar in the field of bilingualism, combining multiple methods and interdisciplinary insights to help advance our understanding of multilingual language control under naturalistic settings. So this prominent rise started, at least in the US, at New York University, where Esti graduated in 2020. And to say that that her talks and publications from her dissertation have left an indelible mark on the field is quite an understatement. So Dr. Blanco-Elorrieta's graduate career was supported by multiple fellowships, including from the La Caixa Foundation. And in 2019, Esti was selected as one of Forbes 30 under 30 in the science category. Her dissertation also won multiple awards, including the Glushko Dissertation Award from the Cognitive Science Society. And she's published several publications in high-impact journals, including Cognition, Trends in Cognitive Science, Nature Scientific Reports, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. I also really greatly appreciate Esti's public-facing scholarship. So her work has prominently been picked up by various media outlets, and she's been gracious enough to give public talks via TEDx, on Spanish and Basque media, and to the excellent NIH workshop on bilingualism and cognitive reserve that was held this past year, just to name a few. Her work is critically important as it addresses the naturalness of bilingual and multilingual language use, which is a topic that many of us deeply care about. And so I'm really looking forward to today's talk. And with that, I'll just say, please join me in welcoming Dr. Blanco-Elorrieta.
Hi, thank you, Jorge. That was a very kind introduction. I'm gonna share my slides. I tested them before, so everything should be fine. But if at any point I say that you should hear something and you don't, you should let me know so that I stop. Okay, so I'm gonna share with you today some of the research that I've done looking into the neurobiology of bilingualism. And the main question that I'm trying to answer is, what is the language architecture of the bilingual brain? And this is, of course, an extremely huge question, but a way to think about it in a little bit more concrete terms is to try and think, well, if we take this to represent the language architecture of monolingual individuals, and we know that to an extent bilinguals have the system but essentially doubled, what are the mechanisms that allow bilinguals to communicate and choose elements only from one language when they need to, but they're also able to fluently mix and match elements from both languages to create sentences such as this one, if the situation allows them to do that. And so in trying to find an answer to this question, a lot of people turn towards paradigms such as this one, in which participants were presented with a number or a picture on the screen, and they were told that they should name it in one language if it appeared in one color, and they should name it in a different language if it appeared in a different color. And so what researchers very consistently found is that whenever bilinguals were switching languages, people made significantly more mistakes, they became slower, and they required increased brain activity. And specifically, this increased brain activity was located to these prefrontal regions, which have been heavily associated with cognitive control and cognitive effort. And so the combination of these three findings, the fact that people were slower, that they made more mistakes, and that they required increased activity from these areas, led researchers to suggest that switching, or to conclude rather, that switching is effortful. And sort of the theoretical inference from this empirical finding was that, well, if switching is in fact inherently effortful, it ought to be the case that there are to an extent, some two independent system, and the cost emerges from having to go from one of the systems to another. And specifically, the way, or like the main theory, as probably all of you know, that was proposed in which this could happen was inhibition. So essentially it suggested, okay, this architecture is split into two, and whenever I'm trying to use one of these systems, I will inhibit the other. When I'm trying to use the other systems, I will inhibit the original one. And so the cost will emerge from having to go back and forth and apply and reapply inhibition to each of these systems in turn. However, is switching really effortful though? Because a lot of you probably are bilingual yourself, or if not, I'm sure you have been around people who are. And if that is the case, you probably have noticed that actually bilinguals switch languages very, very frequently. And it was extremely counterintuitive to me that if this would be such a hard thing to do for individuals, that people would do it all the time on the street, because that's not really how humans work. And so then there seemed to be a tension between the results that people were finding in the lab and what seemed to be the intuitive experience of bilingual individuals, which led me to ask, when we're using this kind of paradigm, are we really tapping onto the real underpinnings of bilingual language switching, or are we perhaps tapping onto something else? And so in order to ask this question, the first thing that I had to do was to figure out what situations are there in which bilinguals switch languages in the real world. And it turns out that there's two of them, or mostly two of them. The first one is whenever there is a bilingual community, such as NYU Abu Dhabi, and if you hear conversations amongst students that are there, chances are that the conversation will sound such as this. The volume will be a little bit low, so pay attention to the conversation.
I have a cousin who was living in North Carolina. اجت على لبنان وفتت على مدرسته. Like she loves it. She absolutely loves it. And if you ask her ما بحياتها بدها ترجع على أمريكا. She says she enjoys it a lot more بلبنان.
Okay, so in this conversation, as you could hear, the conversation goes back and forth between English and Arabic very fluently and very organically. And this is something that occurs very, very commonly whenever there is a bilingual community in which all the people in this community understand both of the languages. And so this is one case in which language switching happens in the real world. And the other case is the situation in which Hugh Grant is in this scene.
I was just telling him about you marrying Hamish, and he said it couldn't have happened to a nicer fellow, so that's nice. Where are you doing it?
Scotland.
Okay, so that's the other situation in which code switching can happen, which is there is a bilingual individual, and there are two monolingual individuals, so two groups of monolingual individuals. And so the bilingual has to switch languages depending on who it is that they're communicating with at each point in time. And this situation is remarkably different from the previous one in that Hugh Grant in this case can no longer freely choose when he is going to switch from one language to another, but rather the switching is going to be imposed upon him by by the identity of the person that he is communicating with. And so having identified these two situations allowed me to ask the first question that I said I wanted to ask, which is how representative are our laboratory paradigms of natural language switching? As I said before, is it the case that when we are using this kind of color-cued paradigm, are we really tapping onto what is going on in the real world? Or could it be that we are accidentally measuring something else? And secondly, I wanted to ask whether switching in all conversational scenarios is qualitatively the same. Or in other words, is there something intrinsic to the process of switching languages that will become active regardless of the circumstances that surround it? Or could it be that whether the switch occurs or is voluntarily and emerges from myself versus versus is dictated by or imposed upon me from the situation could have an influence in the processes that I engage in? And I wanted to test this both in production and in comprehension. And so in order to do that, I designed an experiment in which first I tried to replicate previous experiments. And so I cued with colors for participants the language that they had to use. Then I sort of replicated the Hugh Grant situation. So I introduced my participants to two monolingual speakers, and they were told that they should use the language that matched the language that they communicate, that the interlocutor understood. And last, I introduced them to a bilingual speaker, and they were told that this person understood both English and Arabic. And so whenever they were communicating with this individual, they should feel free to choose whichever language they wanted to communicate with her. And so I had production task in which participants first saw the cue, then they saw a picture and they had to name the picture in the language that matched the cue that they had just seen. In comprehension, participants also saw the interlocutor, then they heard a word and they had to press a button to say yes or no, the picture that I'm seeing matches the word that I've just heard, whereas where the word that they just heard, of course, matched the language that the interlocutor would have produced it in. And while participants were performing these tasks, I recorded MEG activity from the brain, and then I source localized it so that I could tell at each point in time where in the brain activity was coming from. These are the parameters of the recording and such. I'm not going to go into the details because of time, but if anyone has any question about them, I'm very happy to discuss it at the end, because I actually really like talking about methods. So what did we find? Behaviorally, what I'm going to show is going to be the difference between switching and non-switching. So the higher the bars, the bigger the switch effect is going to be. And so what I found was that I replicated previous results. And in fact, when people were switching languages based on this kind of color cues, they were significantly slower. If they were switching languages following in the Hugh Grant scenario, so also the switch was externally imposed upon them, but the cues were more natural, there was still a cost, but this was significantly lower. And whenever they were switching languages while communicating with another bilingual individual, there was no difference between switching or not switching. And the same pattern of results replicated for accuracy. I again replicated that, yes, people made more mistakes if they were switching languages following color cues, but this wasn't true in either of the more natural situations. So sort of the pattern of behavioral results that emerged was that switching is indeed effortful if you put participants in this context where they follow arbitrary color cues. It sort of is, but not as much if they're still following cues, but much, much less so if these cues are more natural. And there didn't seem to be any cost associated with switching if bilinguals switched language completely voluntarily and naturally. And this pattern of results actually was very nicely mirrored in the MEG data. So I started measuring activity at the point in which participants saw the stimulus on the screen. And I found a cluster of activity in these prefrontal regions that we would expect based on previous research. And again, what I found was that, yes, there was increased activity in these areas if participants were switching following color cues. This effect was only marginal if they were following the two monolingual individuals. And there was no cost whatsoever in terms of neural activity associated with switching when they were in the bilingual context. So again, the pattern sort of, as I said, mirrors the behavioral data, which is, yes, it's effortful if we're following color cues. It sort of is, but not quite as much if we're following two monolinguals. And again, there's no evidence to suggest that switching is nearly effortful if we are communicating with another bilingual individual. So this was the results for production. Now, what did we find in comprehension? In comprehension, I found a cluster of activity in the same areas, but here there was no interaction. Instead, what I found was that regardless of the context, there was always increased activity associated with switching languages. But here, the key is that even if I try to make it a little bit more natural by providing them with the identity of the interlocutor and so on, it's actually extremely, extremely rare that you would hear the word for key in English and then you would hear the word for chicken in Arabic. Like no matter what cue I give you, that's an extremely weird context that you don't really encounter in real life. And so the question here was, well, if these switches were embedded within a natural conversation, would this kind of effect still emerge? Would this still be the case? And so there was a secret condition number 3 that I hadn't mentioned before, which is that I had recorded a natural conversation between two bilingual Arabic-English bilinguals. And from that conversation, I extracted chunks that lasted between 45 seconds and a minute. And then I played these recordings to participants where they were in the MEG. And so as I said, the question was, if I tag the neural activity to the point in which you're perceiving these switches within the conversation, will I still see the same kind of prefrontal activity engagement? And so just so that you can have an example of what this sounded like, this is one of the stimuli that I used in the experiment.
So we just ended up with like a bunch of 3-second videos of us just like smiling awkwardly while his friends got super pissed. يعني after a while هيك عم طلعوا علينا طيب خلونا نقعد ننزع الزلمة. I think they got super jealous of all the attention he was getting and he was just like smiling broadly like ايه طلعوا علي يا شباب.
Okay. So what did we find? Is it the case that when these switches are embedded within a natural conversation, such as this one, do we still see that kind of prefrontal activity? And the answer was no. We didn't find any difference whatsoever whenever people were perceiving switches or not in these cognitive control prefrontal regions. However, what I did find an effect was in the auditory cortex. So the auditory cortex did detect that there had been a switch in the input of the language and did react to the fact that that change had happened. And now, as I said, this was a completely natural conversation. So I couldn't really control for a number of confounding factors. So in order to verify that this was in fact an effect of switching and not due to some other potentially uninteresting confounding factors, I ran a multiple regression analysis where, in addition for whether there was a language switch or not, I coded for whether there was a speaker change, what the preceding language was, what the following language was, at what syntactic boundary the switch happened, and at what discourse boundary the switch happened. And by this, what I mean is that sometimes in this conversation, the switches happened at very big boundaries, such as my mom told me blah, blah, blah. And then blah, blah, blah was said in Arabic. And in a sense, if you know that my mom is an Arabic speaker, and if I'm trying to faithfully reproduce the conversation, it is somewhat expected, or it is not surprising that I would reproduce the things exactly as I said in Arabic. Now, sometimes the switches happen at a sentence. So maybe I said something in English and you responded in Arabic. Sometimes they happen at a clause level, at the phrase level, and even at the single word level. And so I was interested in seeing whether the point at which the switch happened, and in a sense, the extent to which it could be predicted or not, will have an effect in the switch effects or in the switch related activity that I found in the auditory cortex. And so in the right auditory cortex, I found that none of these factors had any effect. The only thing that the right auditory cortex responded to was whether there was a switch in the input language or not. But in the left auditory cortex, I found, I think, a very interesting effect, which is that the bigger the boundary, the less activity there was, or perhaps more intuitively the other way around. The shorter the boundary at which the switch happened, the higher the activity that we observed in the auditory cortex. And this actually matches extremely nicely results from information theory and surprisal and entropy that suggest that the more predictable, even within monolingual individuals, that the more predictable something is, the less activity there's going to be. And as things become more unpredictable in discourse, the more activity is elicited in the auditory cortex. And so in a sense, it seems that these results match that kind of understanding of the way our auditory cortex reacts to perceiving information as well. So the take-home messages of the first study, going back to my original questions, are how representative are laboratory paradigms of natural language switching? Well, it seems to be the case that they sort of are of the Hugh Grant situation, but it's definitely the case that using this kind of color cues enhances the switches effects artificially, and it increases prefrontal activity to an extent that isn't really present when we're using more naturalistic circumstances. But then I think more importantly, is switching in all conversational scenarios qualitatively the same? And here the answer is categorically no. We find absolutely no evidence that switching within a natural conversation has any sort of cost or effort associated with it. And we found that switching based on external cues, even if these were natural, still incurs in a little bit of a cost. And so sort of the higher level conclusion from this first study is that switching is not inherently effortful. So it's not part of the language system and an intrinsic property of language switching that there is going to be a cost associated with it, but rather there might be some external circumstances that make it effortful. And so from this study, what we learned is that the fact that we need to follow some external constraint to switch or to guide our behavior is going to incur in our cost, but it's not an intrinsic property of the linguistic system proper. And so having found this out, the second question that I had was, okay, so switching based on external constraint is effortful, but what is it that makes it hard? Why is it that if I'm switching languages because somebody joins the conversation that doesn't speak the language that I've been speaking up until that point, that induces a cost in me, but if I'm talking to my friend who is as bilingual as I am, that is not costly. And so up until now, I have been talking about switching languages as if it were a single step process. But when you try to unpack it and you think about it, it actually tends to be the case that there are a number of steps that go into switching languages if we are following external cues. The first thing is that if I'm speaking English, the first thing that needs to happen is that I need to realize that I need to start speaking something else. So I need to realize that I need to go into a different language. The second thing that needs to happen is that I need to switch off the language that I was speaking up until that point. And the third one is that I need to go into the language that I want to start producing from that moment onwards. And there has been quite a bit of research into how we identify a new language. And the reason why is because it's in a sense trivial to give participants a cue as far enough in advance and look at what happens when they're identifying this information. But trying to unpack these two is actually extraordinarily hard. And the reason why it's very, very hard is because these two are temporarily correlated to the point where most of the times they happen simultaneously. And so in order to take this point home, take this example from George Lopez.
Los shoes amarillos, sí, estaban todos sold out.
Okay, So if we take this sentence, los shoes amarillos, sí, estaban todos sold out. We take the first switch. It is the case that whenever we turn on English, we're gonna have to turn off Spanish. And this is gonna be true in the sentence, regardless of what boundary, at what syntactic, at what point of the discourse, or whatever the switch happens in the sentence. It's always gonna be the case that for me to be able to go into Spanish, I'm gonna have to switch off English, and there's not really a way around it. So how did we dissociate these processes then? Well, the answer was by testing a different population, which are bimodal bilinguals. And although I'm certain that all of you know what these people or what this population looks like, please pay attention to the woman on the screen.
I made a promise to our 6-year-old lead actress that I'd sign this speech.
Okay, so as you could notice, this woman is not just making gestures, she's actually signing at the same time as she is speaking. And even though this might seem like an incredibly hard feat, it's something that bimodal bilinguals do very, very often in their regular life. And so because they're able to produce both at the same time, this gives me a window into being able to dissociate these processes, because I could ask my participants to go from producing both languages at the same time to just producing one, so that I could isolate the process of turning off a language. I could ask them to go from producing just one language to producing both, such that I could isolate the process of turning on a language. And then I could compare both of these trials to a non-switch trials in which they remain in the same language or languages. And so by testing this population, then I could get to my first question of interest, which is which one of these subcomponents is driving the activity, this pattern of prefrontal activity that we keep seeing whenever people switch languages based on external constraints. Or in other words, is it switching a language on or off that is driving this prefrontal activity? And second, testing this population also gave me an opportunity to ask, I think, a fascinating question, which is whether producing two languages is harder than producing one. And so in a sense, someone would say, like, obviously it's gonna be harder because doing two things is always harder than doing one thing. So yes, producing two languages is gonna be harder than producing just one. But somebody else could say, well, you know what, actually, language is such an inherent property of our human nature, and it comes to us so automatically that perhaps it's actually easier if you don't have any motor constraints to let yourself produce everything that you can, as opposed to having to hold something back. And behaviorally, it seemed to be the case that perhaps the second possibility, there was some evidence for the second possibility, but I wanted to test what would happen at the neural level. So in order to do this, I designed an experiment where participants saw a cue that indicated whether they had to only produce English, only produce American Sign Language, or they had to produce both at the same time. And this cue indicated the language in which they had to name the picture that came afterwards. And here I want to take a second to mention that all of my participants in my experiment were American Sign Language English bilinguals, and they were all children of deaf adults, which means that they learned signing since they were very, very little. However, they all lived in New York City, and so all of their life, their work life, their studies, their friends, etc., happened in English. And I'm saying this now because it's going to come in relevant in a couple slides, so keep this information in mind. Okay, so what did I find? Is it turning a language on or off that is driving this prefrontal activity? Well, I found a cluster of activity in these prefrontal regions, as we would have expected. And what I found was that as compared to not switching languages, turning a language on did not require any additional activity. So essentially, asking someone to just be producing one language or add another one on top was essentially the same. However, asking them to hold back or to stop producing whatever they were producing up until that point, that did elicit increased activity, both at the point after seeing the cue in which they realized that they were going to have to stop producing something, and then again, after they had seen the stimuli when they were actually producing the response. So the conclusion of whether it's the turning a language on or off that is driving this activity, the answer is clear, that it was turning a language off that was driving it. And then the second question that I had, is producing two languages harder than producing one? Here, I only took the trials in which participants didn't switch languages, so only the non-switch trials, and I compared the activity when they were producing sign language, English, or both of them at the same time. And I again found a cluster of activity in the same region. And here the question was, well, if I know how much activity is required for me to produce English and how much activity is required for me to produce ASL, is producing both at the same time going to pattern above them, suggesting that it's in fact harder and I require more brain activity to be able to produce both? Or is it going to pattern below, suggesting as the second hypothesis that it's actually easier for a person to produce everything that they can as opposed to having to hold something back. But the results were not as clear as we would have hoped, like on many things in life, because the results fell right in the middle. And here is what the information that I've given you about my participants before comes in relevant, because if you look at the graph, you'll see that producing both at the same time required more activity than producing English, which was the dominant language of these individuals, but it required less than producing just sign language, which was the non-dominant language of these individuals. And I can't show the behavioral results, but actually behaviorally was also the case that producing both at the same time made participants retrieve the signs faster. So it helped them in the lexical retrieval of the signs. So the interim conclusion of whether producing two languages is harder than producing one seems to be that it depends. It depends on what it is that you're comparing it to, whether you are comparing it to your dominant language or to your non-dominant language. So the take-home messages from this second study are, first, switching off processes are the reason why switching following external cues is costly. So it's having to guide behavior, but not just having to guide behavior by cues in general, but rather having to hold yourself back from producing something that is driving this activity. And two, simultaneous production requires more activity than producing just the stronger language, but less than producing the weaker language. And as I said, indeed, it facilitates the production of the weaker language. So by now, I've shown you this activity for a while, this pattern of prefrontal activity. And of course, I wasn't the only person that was finding this activity in prefrontal regions. And because people were finding this activity so often, when bilinguals were switching languages, there were some suggestions that this could be the language control network, so that we could label this the language control network. However, by now we know that this activity is not actually always there when we're switching languages. It disappears during natural language switching. It's only there if we're following external constraints. And in fact, it's specifically there when we have to hold the dominant response back. And so the question then was, well, can we really say then that this is the language control network? And so notice that for this to be true, two premises will have to hold. The first premise that we'll have to hold would be that these areas are active every time we're switching languages, regardless of the circumstances that surround it. And as we've seen already, that premise didn't really hold. But the second premise would be that these areas are active whenever we're switching languages and nothing else. Because if these areas are active when we're switching languages and when we're switching between other types of behaviors or doing other kinds of general control activities, then there isn't really an argument to be made about this being the language control network. And we should instead say, these are the general control network, or these are the general switching language, or whatever else. So this second premise is what I wanted to test in the next experiment. And so in order to be able to test that, an important piece is that you need to design an experiment that has one language switching task and another sort of general domain task that are as similar as possible. And the reason why this really matters, that they're as similar as possible, is because if you were to design two tasks that were fundamentally different and you were to find a difference for the language task, you wouldn't really know if this difference can be ascribed or ought to be ascribed to it being language proper, or it was derived from the fact that these were two separate or two different tasks in general. And so in order to do that, then I designed a task in which participants always saw playing cards. And then there was a language switching task in which participants had to name the numbers on the cards, either in English or in Arabic, depending on the color of the card. And then I designed a category switching task in which participants always stayed in Arabic, and they switch back and forth between semantic categories, either naming the number or naming the suit of the card. And so by doing this, I kept the task constant, I kept the stimuli constant, I even kept half of the answers constant. And so if I were to find a difference now in these regions for the language switching task, I could really, with a high degree of certainty, say that these were really language control areas because they were not involved in anything else. If, however, these areas were to be involved, even when I'm just switching categories within a single language, then there really is no argument to be made about them being the language control network or about this activity being due to language switching, but rather it will have to be ascribed to the task or to the fact that we are modifying our behavior and producing responses based on external indications. So I'm going to show the results. On the left, I'm going to show the results for language switching, and on the right for category switching. What I found for language switching, as we would expect by now, was again a cluster of activity in these areas that was caused by increased activities for switching as compared to not switching. And for the category task, for the category switching task, I found a remarkably similar effect, both spatially and temporally, that was also caused for switching elicited more activity as compared to not switching. So when I saw these results, I was convinced. I was like, okay, this is clear evidence to me that, in fact, these areas are not the language control network and they have nothing to do with the language system proper, but rather they get active whenever participants are put in this sort of paradigm in which they have to follow external instructions to achieve a task. The reviewer number 3 was not as convinced and was like, well, how do you know that these are really the same networks and they're not networks that happen to overlap in time and space? And I was like, okay, so let us check whether that could be the case. And so in order to check that, I used the decoding approach. And so in this decoding approach, what I did was I took all the sources in the cluster that you guys have seen, and I took all the points in time. And so I trained a classifier at each millisecond in time, such that I would say, okay, whenever there is this pattern of activity across these sources, this is a language switching trial. And so when it looks in this other way, this is a non-switching trial. And so I trained a classifier such that at every millisecond in time, so that it could decode whether the pattern of activity that was being elicited in these prefrontal regions were a switch or a non-switch trial. So I trained it in 90% of the trials, and then I tested it in, then the idea is that then you give to a classifier a new piece of data from within the same category, and you ask the classifier, can you tell me what condition this belongs to? And if it has been trained successfully, we'll tell you, yes, this was a non-switch trial. And so the rationale here is that the classifier should be and was successful at training within the language task and testing within the language task. So the classifier learns to distinguish based on the brain activity whether a trial was switch or non-switch within the language task. But the key question here was, if I then presented data from the category switching task, will it continue to accurately tell me what condition the data belongs to? And here the key is that the classifier has never seen the category switching data at all. The only data that it has is from the language switching task. So if it is in fact able to decode this, it has to, like, what it means is that the data is actually, sorry, the pattern of activity actually ought to be the same. It's not that just they overlap, but it's actually the same, because otherwise the classifier would not be able to distinguish switch and non-switch in the category switching task when it has already been trained in language. So what I'm going to show now is going to be on the left, the unfolding over time, and on the right, the accuracy of the classifier when it was trained in the language task and tested in the category task. 50% is the chance level. So it's essentially, because we only have 2 categories, it's essentially a coin toss. So anything that was significantly above 50% chance, that is a significant result of our classifier successfully decoding what kind of trial it was. And so what I found was that starting at 100 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus, the classifier could successfully tell me, even though it had never seen the category data before, so just based on the brain activity from the language task, whether a trial was switch or non-switch. And just for comparative purposes, this was the cross-task result. But when I trained it in language and tested it in language, this was the performance of the decoder. So as you can see, of the classification analysis, as you can see, they almost exactly overlapped. And so now we had, in fact, conclusive evidence to say that this is not the language control network, but rather this is the network for general control that gets engaged whenever we put participants in this kind of, or we force participants to perform this kind of task in which they are guiding their responses based on external demands. So the overall summary of the empirical results that I've shown so far is that language switching following external cues is costly and engages prefrontal cortices, that the engaged prefrontal networks overlap or are really the same as those underlying general domain cognitive controls. As I said, there's not really an argument to be made about these being language networks, that the cost and engagement decreases with the use of more natural cues, and in fact, it fully disappears whenever bilinguals are in fully voluntary situations and this language switching comes from them and is voluntarily and organic, embedded within a natural discourse. And so the key question here then is, what are the theoretical implications of this, or are there any? And I think that there are at least 2 important theoretical implications. The first one pertains the bilingual advantage. And in case somebody isn't fully familiar with what the bilingual advantage is, there is a hypothesis that says that as a consequence of being bilingual, these individuals will develop cognitive advantages. And specifically, these cognitive advantages have mostly been found in whenever people have to pay selective attention to relevant aspects of an environment, when they're inhibiting non-relevant information, and whenever they have to switch on demand between competing alternatives. And this hypothesis has been very heavily debated for the last 10 or 15 years. And at this point in time, it's not really that there's like 40 papers on one camp or the other. There have been over 300 papers showing or claiming that there is a bilingual advantage, and they have claimed all of these different things, such as there is bilingualism contributes to a cognitive reserve, or it delays the onset of Alzheimer's, or even enriches the poor. But there also are another 300 papers questioning whether there is in fact a bilingual advantage. And so they have been things like, there's no smoke without fire, is it a myth or a reality, now you see it, now you don't, or just plainly there is no coherent evidence for a bilingual advantage. And I didn't really have a horse in this race, but it seems to me that at this point, after so much research on both camps on this topic for so many years, it would be extremely hard to believe, like I didn't really see a point of trying to convince whether categorically there is or there isn't a bilingual advantage. So it seemed to me that perhaps a more productive way forward, a more productive avenue would be to think of how we can carve the space of bilingualism to figure out which bilinguals might be able to show advantages if there were to be any. And so going back to the things that bilinguals seem to have been claimed to be better at, we find that they're better at selective attention to relevant aspects of the environment, inhibition of non-relevant information, and switching on demand between competing alternatives. And so if we go back to thinking about what kind of context there are in which bilinguals exist in the real world and the situations that they face, it seemed to me that people who spend a lot of the time, or most of the time, in contexts in which they have to control their languages based on external factors, they do in fact maybe pay selective attention to the environment. They might maybe have to switch on demand between competing alternatives and so on. But for people who live or spend most of their time in a bilingual environment, the use of their language is completely free and there's not really any constraint on it. So they don't really need to pay attention to anything in the environment, and they don't really need to switch on demand between competing alternatives, because they are in fact communicating and using every word of the lexicon unconstrained, the same way that a monolingual person in a monolingual environment would. And so it seemed to me that perhaps trying to think of the ways in which, or the switching behavior of individuals and the kind of environments in which they find themselves could be a key to trying to solve this debate and stop butting heads against each other in these two very categorical positions. And so I also developed the premises, the theoretical premises that could be, or that ought to be true for there to even be room to empirically find a bilingual advantage. And although these proposals are very new, and so there isn't a lot of empirical evidence yet, it seems to be the case that it's not completely off, and that in fact, it might be the case that whether there are or aren't bilingual advantages might be really associated with the kind of environment that bilingual individuals live in or find most of the times themselves in. So this is the first theoretical implication. But the second, and I think most important theoretical implication, has to do with the main question that I said originally I aim to answer, which is, how is the bilingual language architecture organized such that we can communicate successfully? And as I said before, based on the idea that switching was effortful, these proposals have been made that relied on having two somewhat separate systems and switching back and forth between them. But given that now we know that the cost of switching didn't really emerge from the language system, like the source of the cost is not within the language architecture or the lexical system, but rather is external to it, and is in fact can be attributed to the task demands that we have put our participants in, then it no longer follows to have two independent architectures. And so it seems that the most parsimonious explanation would be to argue for a single unified system that contains elements for both of the elements from both languages. And that's why if bilinguals switch languages completely voluntarily, there's no cost associated with this. And not only that, that's why if we look at the real world, we find that bilinguals actually engage in this performance very often. But proposing this architecture now means that we sort of have turned the tables. And now the question is, okay, so if all of the elements are together and there's a jungle mangle of elements from both languages at all points in the bilingual brain, how do they manage to cohesively create sentences in one language or the other without creating a random mix of elements of both languages? And so I also have a proposal for how that might work. And this is an extremely long paper, so I'm just gonna give the very broad strokes of how I think this could work. So if we take this to represent the mental lexicon of a bilingual individual, and so we have on the y-axis the activation levels of elements, and the dashed horizontal line is reflecting the selection threshold. So essentially, whenever any element reaches the selection threshold, that is the candidate that is going to be selected for production. Let's imagine that whenever we look, if we were to pick in a bilingual lexicon, we will have a default state of activation of elements, which is first, or at the baseline level, determined by the word frequency. And here, what I mean by word frequency is how common a word is, but not necessarily at a population level, how common a word is in English, but rather in my idiosyncratic level, how common a word is, or how frequent a word is in my mental lexicon, which will be inherently determined by my language proficiency. So it could be that dog is an extremely popular word in English, but if my English proficiency is very low and I never talk about dogs in English, then the baseline activation level for the word dog in my idiosyncratic mental lexicon is going to be very low. So this is sort of the default state, or let's take it as the default state. And then on top of this, there are, of course, recency of use effects. So as we know, words that have been used much recently, they're going to receive a boost in activation, and they're going to be easier for us to retrieve than words that we haven't talked about in the last 10 years. And so on top of that, of course, the conceptual message that we are trying to convey is going to send activation down to the lexical item. So if I'm trying to talk about dogs, all the semantic features that compose the meaning of a dog are going to send activation down to all the lexical elements that share features with it. And this is important because it means that in this case, even if I'm trying to talk about dogs and the semantic features of dog are legs and mammal and furry and barks, all of the elements in the lexicon that are associated with this are going to receive activation. So in this case, cat will also receive activation because it also has legs, it's also a mammal, and it's also furry, even if it doesn't bark. And then lastly, on top of all of this combination of activation, there's going to be another additional node, which is going to be the communicative context. And here it's important to note that communicative context does not only pertain to the language in which we're trying to communicate, but it also pertains to the register, the dialect, the level of specification, and all of these other audience considerations that actually do very much restrict our lexical selection and the words that we end up producing, even if they're not proper to the lexical system. And so here, importantly, the activation boost, or the activation that the language node sends, ought to be strong enough to send the candidate in the target language above the selection threshold, as compared to the language that is not in the non-intended language, because otherwise what will happen is what happens sometimes, or relatively often, depending on the proficiency with bilinguals, that they end up producing the word in the non-intended language. And so, one important thing is that even though I've described this process sequentially, in theory, the architecture occurs completely simultaneously, and the combination of this activation flows down synchronously from all of different factors to the lexical system. And one of the benefits that of taking or assuming this kind of architecture is that these principles can actually very easily be generalized to the rest of the levels of representation of the language system. And so this is extremely important because for the first time then we have a system that can not only account for what happens during lexical selection, but also during the morphosyntactic selection and how we select phonemes. And so again, extremely long to explain, but the main principles are their first equal principles rule all the levels independently. And by this, what I mean is that the same way that I just described how the combination of activation from all these different factors will rule lexical selection, the same will be true, as I said, for the morphosyntactic level. And so, for instance, what that would mean is that whenever I'm trying to say, create a noun out of an adjective, I will choose from my derivative morphology the element that receives, from the meaning that I'm trying to create a noun, also from the language that I'm intending, also from the register that I'm intended, and so on. And the candidate that has the most information, the most activation will be the one selected for production. And the reason why it's important that these levels are ruled independently is because this way we can easily explain the phenomenon that often happens for bilinguals, which is that they might take the lexical element of one language add the morphology of a different language and produce it with the phonology of either the first language or the second language. So it really is independent which will win in each, or where the activation levels will go above selection threshold in each of these levels. Then the second principle that is very important is, as I said, that the language node is not unique. So if we think about how we communicate, sometimes we think of bilingualism as like a categorically different experience, but bidialectal individual, by registered individual, people who speak African American vernacular and standard English, they also have a lot, if not the same considerations as people who are bilingual. And so in this model, the language node is not unique. And so it works in exactly the same way the rest of the features that send activation down to the lexical system do. And doing this also has a huge advantage, which is that if one claims that there is something particular to the language node that is not true for the rest of the lexical system or for the lexical system of monolingual individuals, then one has to be extremely cautious and really deeply develop what are the premises under which this different, categorically different node might emerge, how it develops, and what it means in terms of development, clinical implications, and so on. But so making it be the same as the rest of the system and the same as the rest of the features, then allows us to have a system that is able, that is the system that we are born with. It doesn't need to develop specifically, and it's able to account for all these different, as I said, audience consideration of features that influence lexical selection. And so the consequence of the language node not being unique is, as I just mentioned, that essentially monolingual and bilingual language selection and language production can occur within the same framework and operating under the same principles. So does that mean that the puzzle is solved then? Absolutely not. Even though I think this architecture will take us much, much closer to try to really understanding deeply and thoroughly what the language architecture of bilingual individuals is. The puzzle is still far from solved. I think there are many fine-grained and detailed principles that we still need to figure out, a lot of similarities across different levels that are still waiting for to be unveiled and so on, which is what I want to invite everyone to try and think of what these other principles that need to be fine-tuned might be. So with this, I want to finish thanking all of my supervisors, collaborators, the people in my lab, and all the funding agencies that have funded my research. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Esti. I'm just wondering maybe if you want to, at least for the moment, unshare your slides so we can all see each other to enter into the discussion. And actually, I will let you handle the questions. I'm sure there are several questions. You've given us so much food for thought. So please feel free.
Eleonora.
Hi, Esti. Thank you for the very interesting talk and the many, many pieces of it. I had question about the study with the bimodal bilinguals. So you found that there was basically no cost associated to switching on both languages, but there was an effect when people needed to disengage with one of the languages. So the very nice finding. It seems to me, though, that bimodal bilinguals, we know from other literature that they are, in fact, for certain reasons, very different from unimodal bilinguals. And so I wonder whether part of your result could be driven from the fact, and correct me if you think that the reasoning is not flowing. So when bimodal bilinguals, because they can co-sign and speak, switching both languages by nature for them shouldn't be costly. However, and we cannot do so. Unimodal bilingual cannot spit out two languages at the same time, right? So we know that, of course. So I don't know experimentally how we could do that, but I wonder whether there could be a way to look at, when a unimodal bilingual needs to somehow switch on both languages, whether we might see maybe a partially different result, just because for unimodal bilinguals, that might be a mechanism that might be more costly than for bimodal bilinguals. Jason is actually suggesting simultaneous translators or interpreters. That could be an interesting, so I was just wondering whether, your thoughts about replicating on or advancing this line, that study thinking about different populations in which we could really try also again to tease apart this switch on, switch off maintenance of both languages. Thank you, Esti.
Yeah, yes, I have thought about that, and I used to get that question all the time. So I actually, yes, I ran a study with some collaborators in China, and we tested, I thought a lot about how can we do this with people who only speak, so monomodal bilinguals, and you are right, it's a hard problem, which is why originally we ended up with the bimodal ones. So what we did instead was test trilingual individuals. And so the way in which the experiment worked was that either in one condition, say they were Japanese, Chinese, and English trilinguals. And so in one condition, say they were speaking English and they were told you have to switch off English, but essentially you can go into whatever you want. Versus in another condition, they were like, you need to turn on, say, Chinese. So like you specifically have to go into the Chinese. And so what we found was actually, we ran it, I mean, they ran it. I didn't do most of the work. I just did the theoretical thinking here, but they ran it with EEG. And they actually found very, very overlapping effects, both behaviorally and in terms of EEG. I can send you a paper later, it's in cognition. And yeah, essentially the results were the same. There was effect associated with switching off, but switching on essentially didn't really come with a cost or was much easier.
Thank you. And thank you. Yeah, later, whenever, if you have that reference, that would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, thanks.
Christos.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to come back to the whole bilingual advantage discussion. And you mentioned that it's time to move away from whether bilinguals have or don't have an advantage and focus on which types of bilinguals may or are more likely to produce an advantage. Thank you. I think that's what we all think nowadays. So the way you talked about different contexts, reminding me a bit of the ACH or the dual language context versus the dense switching context. So my question was, is your suggestion that we should use those contexts to see which bilinguals are more likely to show advantages? Or would you be more receiving to other approaches that some of us use here, and more continuous approaches? So you measure bilingual experiences, see how they affect both brain function and structure, but also the underlying behavior, the ensuing behavior, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think there has to be categorical. I think the continuous approach is much more fruitful. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, so I think like one problem that we are going to encounter and we encounter all the time is that it's extremely hard to measure these things. Like even when I think of myself, like let alone other participants, if I think of myself, which is the participant that I know the best, if I try to quantify how many times do I switch, which percentage of the time do I spend speaking each language and so on, I'm like, well, now I'm in the US, so probably most of the time I speak English, but like, what about the 17 years that I wasn't here? And like all of these things. So I think continuous approaches are definitely the better way. I think we have a huge challenge in trying to figure out how to measure that, and not only how to measure that for ourselves, but like in some way that is replicable for other people, because else we're going to find ourselves forever in this argument of like, like people in Canada find something and people in Barcelona don't, but like we don't know how those people differ from each other. And so I think that so yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly, continuous approaches, but I think we need to establish also, and it's paramount that we establish some way in which we can measure this in some sort of objective and replicable way.
Did you have any ideas of how to improve this? Because we have something like the entropy that Deborah Catone and Galliffer have, been using. Or do you have any ideas of how to do that? Because I'm interested. I don't know myself, right? What's the best way?
Yeah. Well, Gulliver's, if I know correctly what you're referring to, measuring in the environment the amount of input that there is and so on, that still is very say like I live in Cambridge, right? And if one were to measure the amount of English that's spoken in Cambridge versus Spanish, that would probably be 95% to 5% maybe. Mm-hmm. But it just turns out that most of my friends here are Spanish. So for me, that's actually not true, because my English is only in the lab and then when I go to a shop, you know what I mean? So I feel like I think maybe the kind of approaches, I think maybe the best approach would be something like people have done for the babies when they put this device and they have the device carrying around, and then they gather data for like 2 or 3 days. And then from those 2 or 3 days, they make inferences for what the life must be like. But of course, I think, do you know what the device that I'm talking about that they take for how babies learn? So I think maybe something like that would be the most objective thing, because I feel like as soon as we enter the realm of self-evaluation or providing these kind of measures, then or making assumptions about the population for the individual, in the case of bilinguals, it becomes very, very hard. Now, I know that this approach will have a lot of pragmatic issues, which is who is going to carry around this thing for 3 days to be a participant in your study. So I think ideally that would be a solution, but now how to implement that, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Jason, did you have a question?
I did, but it was somewhat similar to Christos, although maybe I can add a little bit to the discussion if that's okay. I think, well, I'm glad to hear that you think that continuous approaches are at least in a move in the right direction, right? But I think that the premise that underlies them, you would have some objection to, right? Because I think when we're looking at continuous variables, we're trying to find proxies that mathematically get us some type of approximation of how much opportunity there is for switching to take place, right? Ultimately. And if that's not the mechanism that you think is primarily implicated here, and if you make space for the fact that at least under certain societal conditions, there might be some knock-on effects. I take exception to the word advantage anyway, and I think most people, even within the so-called debate, do at this point. Anyway, it's reductionist, I think. But if we're trying to quantify context opportunities over a space of time for switching to have taken place, then, well, that doesn't accord with your view anyway, right? So whether you take a Gulliver type of view, whether you take, a myriad of questionnaires that are out there, they're really trying to find the relative density of switching, right? Or opportunities for engagement and disengagement and inhibition and so on and so forth. So continuous, yes, but you probably still have a problem with the premise that underlies it, no?
Well, yeah, so I think there's 2 issues to be discussed. One is empirical and the other is theoretical. And so the first one, theoretical, is what is the theory that we have as to what the precursors, the cognitive precursors ought to be in place for an advantage to even potentially develop. And once you have an explicit theory of what that can be, which we don't know, we don't have an explicit theory of that yet, then one can go into the empirical issue, for which I do believe in continuous approaches, which is if you do have an explicit theory of this and you ought to test it particularly, then you certainly do need to have this kind of approaches. So you are right in a sense. Yes, I do have an issue with the underlying thing, but just because it hasn't, I don't actually have a horse in the race of whether there is or there isn't an advantage. Like, as far as I'm concerned, I wish there were one established one that we could advocate for when we advocate for linguistic policy and so on. Like, that would be fantastic. However, what I do have issue with is that I don't think the theoretical tenets have been developed enough. And in Spanish, there's a saying that you are a blind person hitting with a stick, which is essentially you don't really know essentially what you're doing and you hope to hit something. And that's sort of the issue that I have. So if the theoretical tenets are developed, then yes, the practicality of the continuous approaches, I think it would be the way to go. Jorge.
Can I ask something?
Yeah. No, you can go. Sorry, Jason. Follow.
Just one other, I guess, I don't know if it's really not a direct follow-up to this, but you made a distinction between certain types of contexts of bilingualism at a macro sense, right? So let's exclude, let's say the northern part of Spain because of the context of bilingualism and how it proliferates, which is quite interesting because I've had this conversation with Jan Andoni a lot. We do stuff together and we have very different opinions about how things will fall out. And, maybe it is possible that some of the reason for which you don't see replications of things in their studies is precisely because of the context in which it appears, right? So, but I do have a question because, if you take an individual difference approach, I'm sure you don't preclude, maybe you do, the fact that in different contexts, so let's take Spanish in the United States, for example, right? So Spanish in certain contexts in Los Angeles for certain individuals will get you very close to a context very similar to the distribution of Spanish with Basque in the Basque Country, but only for certain Basque communities, right? What's true of Bilbao is certainly not true of small rural communities and vice versa, right? So is it really the context, or is it ultimately the individual context, and certain environments will have skewed probabilities towards that, but ultimately we can agree that it really is down to how the individual engages, and environments in a macro sense can be proxies for the probabilities of how we'll find the proportions of how we'll find those people in those environments.
Definitely latter. Definitely, ultimately, is the individual, and there's just a skewed probability in certain regions' population. When I meant the claim about Catalonia, it wasn't about specifically about Catalonia. I was just putting an example. But no, yeah, ultimately individual differences, and it just so happens, as you said, that there's skewed probabilities in given geographic or socio-political distributions to find one type of individual or the other. Jorge.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to follow that same sort of line of thought and conversation, because there's two things that I have been thinking about in relationship to this. So number one, I want to return to something that Eleonora said about, the context of bimodal bilingualism. One paper that for me, I find very particularly convincing to sort of, let's say, my perspective is this Pyers and Emery study, I think from 2008. Where all they did was, Emery et al. 2008, which all that they did was quantify the sort of likelihood that the bimodal bilinguals would code blend versus code switch. And the code blending was much more prominent than code switching, which at least to me sort of suggested in kind of a similar line to Eleonora said that given the choice, we would rather produce at the same time than go from one to the other language, which the interpretation you can take from that is that the fact that unimodal bilinguals have no choice but to code switch means that they're doing something more than, say, being able to produce at the same time. So I'm trying to figure out how to sort of square those pieces with the results that you're presenting. And so I'll just stick that there just as a meta comment, I guess. And then the second thing is the developmental trajectory here, right? So when do bilinguals, as they're acquiring their two languages, are they able to deploy this ability to sort of naturalistically switch? So I wouldn't assume that, say earlier, if you're earlier on your stage of second language development, for example, that you would freely be able to code switch, or that maybe you aren't trying to inhibit the first language, for example. So at some point, this probably needs to come online, this ability to not see these costs. And I'm just wondering if you've thought about that developmental angle as well.
Yeah, so second question first. Developmentally, I disagree. Like, if they are bilingual kids who are really bilingual from birth, they code switch all the time. And not only do they code switch all the time, they most of the times are not even aware that they're using two different languages. And so there isn't a point in which this ability to code switch needs to emerge, because essentially that is the way in which they communicate. And if you, the kind of developmental point that you've made only really is necessary if you believe in an architecture that is distinctly between the two, and then you are believing that there is a mechanism that at some point needs to be born for you to be able to handle mixing from one part to another. But if you ascribe to a theory that it doesn't need to be exactly the one I proposed, but something similar to that, where all elements are part of the same language, then it doesn't posit any challenge developmentally. The kids acquire all the elements of all the language, and they will always take whatever is more active. And sometimes that will be the same. Sometimes it will be different language. And that's also even why they're not even aware that they belong to different languages, because in their speech, they're just a production of a sentence. And it just so happens that some of the words that they put belong to a different sentence, to a different language. So that's the question, the answer to question number two. To question number one was, bimodal bilinguals will more eagerly code blend than code switch, and which is true. And you're saying, would unimodal bilinguals also always choose to produce both if given the chance to? And the fact that they don't, does that put some extra hard, like something extra that is hard on them, right? That's what you said. Well, I think it depends. I think it depends on the context of the switching. I think that if you are, it really depends. So take, for instance, if you are an unbalanced bilingual and say my Spanish is perfect and my French is not very good. If I'm speaking Spanish I would really extremely rarely switch to French. That's not really going to happen. But if you force me to speak in French and then somebody comes who also speaks Spanish, then the chances are that I will more likely to go into Spanish because that is actually helping me. So in that case, maybe yes, you would produce both of them at the same time, but you wouldn't find the reason, like it wouldn't make sense for you when you are speaking your your easiest language to produce, for you to start code blending and include the second language. And that actually matches the results that I found, which is when people were producing English, which was the dominant language, they didn't find it easier to produce both at the same time. But if they were trying to produce ASL, which was the non-dominant language, then producing both did in fact help them. And so to that extent, I think, yes, you might be right. I think that if unimodal bilinguals could produce both languages at the same time, when they were producing their weaker language, they probably would rely as a crutch on the dominant language to help them with lexical retrieval, which has been found to be true. But if they were speaking the dominant language, then they probably don't have a need for a crutch. That's not going to help them. So I think they probably then would not engage in that behavior.
Well, I'll just ask then just a quick, well, I don't know if it's follow-up, but so I think we still need to work out whether the language mixing that children engage in is qualitatively similar to the type of switching behavior that older bilinguals engage in. I don't know if that changes anything. And I guess from my perspective, you know, I like this single architecture for the bilingual lexicon. And I think I'm a proponent of shared as much as possible, which maybe isn't exactly a single architecture, but I'm certainly like of that mindset. Yet I still find myself sort of thinking that there are appreciable differences, and I don't need to call them sort of harder or easier or anything like that. But for example, at some point, again, the bilingual who is willing to switch, let's call it, especially when languages look more different, are willing to do things that would not happen in a single language alone, right? So I'm thinking of instances as, for example, presumably among some Basque Spanish code switching communities, there's this a tendency to duplicate the determiner so that you get la, then the Spanish word, and then the Basque coming at the end of the noun. Or we find this with prepositions and postpositions. Certainly there are situations where you know, they encounter SVO versus SOV word order, and then do things that are very bilingual and that are different from the monolingual case. And so I'm just wondering how that develops again. It can't come for free just for knowing the two languages is sort of the starting point for me.
Well, but actually, that's a very interesting phenomenon. And in that, as I said, it's a very long paper, but it's a special section specifically about duplication and actually about how duplication occurs at all the levels of representation. So it does seem to be general behavior. So it occurs in phonology, it occurs in morphology, it occurs in syntax, and it occurs at the lexical level across languages. So that I agree with you, that is a fundament, but I don't, and like I think a principle that replicates across all levels, but that's not to say that you have to have. So duplication to me seems to me a way to fix the syntax. So there are given points in the sentence in which switching is allowed, right? And so you won't violate. So the point in which the surface structures of the sentences align, those are places in which the switching will carry no syntactic consequences. So those are things. Okay, if you choose to switch at places in which it is allowed because the surface structure align at that point, but the leftover either to the left or to the right, so either what you set until the point or what comes after do not align, then you will encounter the duplication issue. And so I think that's just a repair mechanism to try to fix it, but it's not really that. I don't think it's that you've acquired the knowledge as to, I don't think you've acquired categorically different knowledge as to how to compose these kind of sentences, but rather you've acquired the syntax rules of both of them. And you realize when you've gone into the other language that, say for instance, the example that you put in Spanish and in Basque, the relative clause in Spanish, you begin in the beginning. So you have main clause, then que, then relative clause. In Basque, you have la at the very end, and that marks that is a relative clause. So Basque people do all the time. First sentence, Spanish, que, second sentence in Basque, and add the la at the end. But the thing is, like, at this point, you were still in Spanish, so you needed the que. And then for whatever reason, you've gone into Basque for the lexicon, and you say for the lexical issues, like you couldn't retrieve this word in Spanish. So you go to Basque, and once you go to Basque, you need to fix the syntax, and so you need to do the application. So I don't think it's like the categorical acquiring of a different system, but rather you've acquired the rules and you adapt to make that grammatical to the extent that you can. I think actually looking at that kind of paradigm and looking at the kinds of places where these things happen and like can happen or cannot happen, I think that's going to give us I think it's going to be a very productive avenue. And I think that really is going to give us clues into like these switching experiments, demo day. I think we need to move on. But I think that kind of thing that you said, like looking at these duplications, where they happen, why they happen at different levels, do they follow the same patterns, do they follow the same framework? I think that's where the answers are going to be moving forward.
Thank you. So this is really interesting. I want to converse so much more. I'm already late to another meeting, so I'm going to exit, but I think this will make you host back again, Suad?
I guess so.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Esti. I'm sorry that I have to cut out at this point.
No, it's fine. I need to go and like, yeah, I also need to.
Recording the recording.
Oh yeah, I can stop it here now. Does that sound good?
Whatever you want, yeah.